How to Understand Our Past by Christopher Dawson. No one can look at the history of Western civilization during the present century without feeling dismayed at the spectacle of what modern man has done with his immense resources of new knowledge and new wealth and new power. And if we go back to the 19th century and read the words of the scientists and social reformers, or the liberal idealists, and realize the mood of unbounded hope and enthusiasm in which this movement of world change was launched, the contrast is even more painful. For not only have we failed to realize the ideals of the 19th century, we are all more or less conscious of the worst dangers to come: greater and more destructive wars, more ruthless forms of despotism, more drastic suppression of human rights. It is no good going on with the dismal catalogue. We know it all only too well. There is no need to listen to the alarmist predictions of writers like George Orwell or Aldous Huxley. It is enough to read the newspapers to convince ourselves that the cause of civilization is no longer secure, and that the great movement of Western man to transform the world has somehow gone astray. Whatever may be the ultimate cause of this crisis, it is certain that it is a spiritual one, since it represents the failure of civilized man to control the forces that he has created. It is due above all to the loss of common purpose in Western culture and the lack of a common intelligence to guide the new forces that are changing human life. Yet this failure is certainly not due to the neglect of education in modern society. No civilization in history has ever devoted so much time and money and organization to education as our own. And it is one of the most tragic features of the situation that our failure has been the failure of the first society to be universally educated, one which had been subjected to a more systematic and completely national education than any society of the past. In spite of this, there is no doubt that the modern European and American system of universal education suffered from serious defects. In the first place, the achievement of universality was purchased by the substitution of quantitative for qualitative standards. Education was accepted as a good in itself, and the main question was how to increase the total output, how to teach more and more people more and more subjects for longer and longer periods. But in proportion as education became universal, it became cheapened. Instead of being regarded as a privilege of the few, it became a compulsory routine for everybody. It is difficult for us to imagine the state of mind of a man like Francis Place, laboring at all hours of the night after a hard day's work out of sheer passion for knowledge. In the second place, the establishment of a universal system of public education inevitably changed the relations of education to the state. It is this, above all else, which has caused the mind of our society to lose its independence, so that there is no power left outside politics to guide modern civilization when the politicians go astray. For in proportion as education becomes controlled by the state, it becomes nationalized, and in extreme cases, the servant of a political party. This last alternative still strikes us here in England as outrageous, but it is not only essential to the totalitarian state, it existed before the rise of totalitarianism, and to a great extent created it, and it is present as a tendency in all modern societies, however opposed they are to totalitarianism in its overt form. For the immense extension of the scale of education and its ramification into 100 specialisms and technical disciplines has left the state as the only unifying element in the whole system. In the past, the traditional system of classical education provided a common intellectual background and a common scale of values, which transcended national and political frontiers and formed the European or Western Republic of letters, of which every scholar was a citizen. All the old systems of primary and secondary education presupposed the existence of this intellectual community, which they served, and from which they received guidance and inspiration. The primary school taught children their letters, the grammar school taught them Latin and Greek, so that educated men everywhere possessed a common language and the knowledge of a common literature or two common literatures. Now, from the modern point of view, this traditional education was shockingly narrow and pedantic. It was also useless, since it had no direct bearing on the life of the modern world, on the world's work, and on the techniques of modern civilization. Therefore, the 19th century reformers insisted first that education should be widened to include the whole realm of modern knowledge, and secondly, that it should be made practically useful in order to produce skilled technicians and trained specialists, or research workers. These two great reforms have been generally applied, not without success, all over the world during the last 50 or 100 years. But what has been the result? The domain of universal knowledge is too vast for any mind to embrace, and the specialization of the technician and the research worker has become so minute that it leaves no common intellectual bond between the different branches of knowledge. A Russian expert in applied research on plant biology, a French specialist in the history of the Romance lyric, an English worker on atomic research, an American expert in social pathology, all these do not belong to any sort of spiritual community like the Humanist Republic of Letters. They are just individuals with special jobs, and there is a much stronger bond between all the Russians and all the Frenchmen, and so on, than between scientists as such or technicians as such. No doubt the discipline of scientific research does produce a common type of intelligence and even a common type of character, but so did the older professional disciplines, so that there is a considerable similarity between staff officers or drill sergeants in the armies of the different great powers. But a similarity of this kind on the level of technique does not necessarily make for a similarity on the level of culture, and the same holds good for the scientific specialist. Indeed, under present conditions, the two types are rapidly becoming assimilated, so that the scientific expert and the military expert are alike instruments of the unified power organization of the modern state. Up to a point, this is inevitable, granted the complex nature of the modern scientific and technological order. But if it is allowed to develop uncriticized and unchecked, it is fatal to the old ideals of Western culture as a free spiritual community. It leads to the totalitarian state, and perhaps even beyond that, to the completely mechanized mass society, to the brave new worlds and the nightmares of scientific utopianism in reverse. How is it possible to preserve the guiding mind of civilization and to salvage the spiritual traditions of Western culture? The philosopher, the religious leader, the statesman, and the educationist all share this responsibility. All have a part to play. But the responsibility of the educationist is perhaps the most immediate and the heaviest of all, because it is in the sphere of education that the immediate decisions must be taken which will determine the outlook of the next generation. In the past, as we have seen, education attempted to perform this higher function by means of the traditional classical discipline of humane letters. In other words, of Latin and Greek. But we must be careful to distinguish between this particular form of higher education and higher education in general, and not to reduce the central inescapable problem to the old controversy between conservative classicism and radical modernism. It is quite possible that the traditional form of classical education has become completely antiquated and can no longer provide the universal unifying element which our civilization requires. But the fact that classical education no longer fulfills that purpose does not mean that civilization can dispense with such a unifying element altogether, or that it can be found on a purely technological level. On the contrary, We need it more than ever before, and the more widely we extend the range of education, the more necessary it is to provide some principle of cohesion to counterbalance the centrifugal tendencies of specialization and utilitarianism. Every form of education that mankind has known, from the savage tribe to the highest forms of culture, has always involved two elements: the element of technique and the element of tradition. And hitherto, it has always been the second that has been the more important. In the first place, education teaches children how to do things, how to read and write, and even, at a much more primitive level, how to hunt and cook, and plant and build. But besides all these things, education has always meant the initiation of the young into the social and spiritual inheritance of the community. In other words, education has meant the transmission of culture. Now, the old classical education was a rather specialized and stylized type of this procedure. It took the tradition of humanism as embodying the highest common factor of Western culture and trained the young to appreciate it by an intensive course of philological discipline. At first sight, it seems highly absurd to take an English farmer's son or the son of a German shopkeeper and drill him into writing imitation Ciceronian prose or copies of Latin verses. Yet, for all that, it did set the stamp of a common classical tradition on a dozen vernacular European literatures, and give the educated classes of every European country a common sense of the standard classical values. But it was only able to succeed in this specialized intellectual task because it was an intellectual superstructure that was built on a common spiritual tradition. Classical education was only half the old system of European education. Below it and above it, there was the religious education that was common to the whole people, and the higher theological education that was peculiar to the clergy, who provided the majority of the teachers in both the other departments of education. Now, the lower level of this structure, which has been least studied and least regarded, was the most important of them all. It is true that it differed considerably in different parts of Europe, but for religious rather than material reasons. In Protestant Europe, it was founded on the Bible and the Catechism, whereas in Catholic Europe, it was based on the liturgy and on religious art and drama and mime, which made the church the school of the people. But in either case, it provided a system of common beliefs and moral standards, as well as the archetypal patterns of world history and sacred story, which formed the background of their spiritual world. Thus considered as a means for the transmission of culture, classical education, important as it was, formed only one part of the whole system of social education by which the inheritance of culture was transmitted, so that even if it were possible to preserve or to restore classical education, it would by itself prove quite ineffective as a solution for our present problem. What we need is not merely to find a substitute for the classical humanistic element in the old system, it is the system as a whole, from top to bottom, which has disappeared. And if the spiritual continuity of Western culture is to be preserved, we must face the problem as a whole and remember the importance of the common spiritual foundation on which the superstructure of higher classical education was built. It is the failure to recognize this fact which has been largely responsible for the separation of higher education from its spiritual roots in the life of the people, so that our idea of culture has become a sublimated abstraction instead of the expression of a living tradition which animates the whole society and unites the present and the past. If we are to make the ordinary man aware of the spiritual unity out of which all the separate activities of our civilization have arisen, it is necessary, in the first place, to look at Western civilization as a whole and to treat it with the same objective appreciation and respect which the humanists of the past devoted to the civilization of antiquity. This does not seem much to ask, yet there have always been a number of reasons which stood in the way of its fulfillment. In the first place, there has been the influence of modern nationalism, which has led every European people to insist on what distinguished it from the rest, instead of what united it with them. It is not necessary to seek for examples in the extremism of German racial nationalists and their crazy theories, proving that everything good in the world comes from men of Germanic blood. Leaving all these extravagances out of account, we still have the basic fact that modern education, in general, teaches men the history of their own country and the literature of their own tongue, as though these were complete wholes and not part of a greater unity. In the second place, there has been the separation between religion and culture, which arose partly from the bitterness of the internal divisions of Christendom, and partly from a fear lest the transcendent divine values of Christianity should be endangered by any identification or association of them with the relative human values of culture. Both these factors have been at work long before our civilization was actually secularized. They had their origins in the Reformation period, and it was Martin Luther in particular who stated the theological dualism of faith and works in such a drastic form as to leave no room for any positive conception of a Christian culture, such as had hitherto been taken for granted. And in the third place, the vast expansion of Western civilization in modern times has led to a loss of any standard of comparison or any recognition of its limits in time and space. Western civilization has ceased to be one civilization amongst others. It became civilization in the absolute sense. It is the disappearance or decline of this naive absolutism and the reappearance of a sense of the relative and limited character of Western civilization as a particular historic culture, which are the characteristic features of the present epoch. And at the same time, we have begun to doubt the validity of the nationalistic approach to history and culture, and to realize the evil and folly of the blind sectarian feuds that have broken up the social unity of Christendom during recent centuries. Thus, it would seem as though the main obstacles to the understanding of Western civilization as a historic reality have begun to break down, and the time is ripe for a new, positive approach to the whole problem. But there remains one serious obstacle, or rather, there has arisen a new obstacle which was not present in the past. The events of the last 40 years have inflicted such a blow to the self-confidence of Western civilization and to the belief in progress, which was so strong during the 19th century, that men tend to go too far in the opposite direction. In fact, the modern world is experiencing the same kind of danger which was so fatal to the ancient world, the crisis of which Gilbert Murray writes in his Four Stages of Greek Religion as the loss of nerve. There have been signs of this in Western literature for a long time past, and it has already had a serious effect on Western culture and education. This is the typical tragedy of the intelligentsia as shown in 19th century Russia and often in 20th century Germany. The case of a society or a class devoting enormous efforts to higher education and to the formation of an intellectual elite, and then finding that the final result of the system is to breed a spirit of pessimism and nihilism and revolt. There was something seriously wrong about an educational system which canceled itself out in this way, which picked out the ablest minds in a society and subjected them to an intensive process of competitive development which ended in a revolutionary or cynical reaction against the society that produced it. But behind these defects of an over-cerebralized and over-competitive method of education, there is the deeper cause in the loss of the common spiritual background which unifies education and social life. For the liberal faith in progress which inspired the 19th century was itself a substitute for the simpler and more positive religious faith which was the vital bond of the Western community. If we wish to understand our past and the inheritance of Western culture, we have to go behind the 19th century development and study the old spiritual community of Western Christendom as an objective historical reality. The study and understanding of this cultural tradition ought to be given the same place in modern education as the study of the Greco Roman tradition received in the classical humanist education of the past. For the culture of Christendom is not only of vital importance to us genetically as the source of our own culture, it also has a greater intrinsic value than even the classical culture possessed. At first sight, this may be questioned by the humanist, but I think that reflection will show that it is true even from the humanist point of view. For humanism itself, as we know it, is not the humanism of the Greeks and Romans, but a humanism which has been transmuted, if not created, by the Christian culture of the West. It is not merely that Erasmus and Vives and Grotius deserve our attention just as much as Quintilian and Cicero. It is that behind these men there is a living tradition, reaching back through Petrarch and John of Salisbury to Alcuin and Bede and Boethius. And it was this that built the spiritual bridge across the ages by which classical culture passed into the life of Western man. The existence of this spiritual community, or psychological continuum, is the ultimate basic reality which underlies all the separate activities of modern Western societies, and which alone makes Western education possible. The obvious difficulty that has prevented the study of European culture becoming a part of the regular curriculum of studies is its vastness and its complexity. The great advantage of classical education was the fact that it involved the study of only two languages and two literatures and histories. But European culture has produced about 20 vernacular literatures, and its history is spread out among an even larger number of political communities. At first sight, it is an unmanageable proposition, and we can understand how educationalists have so often come to acquiesce in a cultural nationalism which at least saved them from being overwhelmed by a multiplicity of strange tongues and unknown literatures. But the true method, it seems to me, is rather to find the constitutive factors of the European community and to make them the basis of our study. This means reversing the traditional nationalist approach, which concentrated the student's attention on the distinctive characteristics of the national cultures and disregarded or passed lightly over the features that they shared in common. It means also that we should have to devote much more attention to the religious development, since it was in religion that Europe found its original basis of unity. In the past, there has been a tendency to treat political history and ecclesiastical history as self-contained subjects, and to leave the history of religion to the ecclesiastical historians. But no serious historian can be satisfied with this state of affairs, since it destroyed the intelligible unity of culture and left the history of culture itself suspended uneasily between political and ecclesiastical history, with no firm basis in either of them. It is essential to realize that the Christian community in the past was not a pious ideal, but a juridical fact which underlay the social organization of Western culture. For more than 1,000 years, the religious sacrament of baptism, which initiated a man into the Christian community, was also a condition of citizenship in the political community. The obligations of canon law or church law were binding in a greater or less degree in common law, so that even in a Protestant land, like England, the fundamental questions of personal status and property, everything connected with the marriage contract and the right of bequest, fell within the purview of the courts Christian. The Old English saying, or legal maxim, that Christianity was the law of the land, faithfully reflects the situation which existed in Europe for 1,000 years and more, from the time when the barbarian kingdoms first accepted Christianity. For this reception of Christianity was a solemn public act which involved the acceptance of a new way of life and a corporate adhesion to a new international community. Now, the comprehension of the nature of this sociological and psychological change is of much greater educational importance than most of the history that we were taught in our school and university days. This was a matter that we were supposed to learn from other sources. Whether we did so or not depended mainly on personal experience and family tradition. Even today, very little thought is given to the profound revolution in the psychological basis of culture by which the new society of Western Christendom came into existence. Stated in the terms of Freudian psychology, what occurred was the translation of religion from the sphere of the id to that of the superego. The pagan religion of the northern barbarians was a real force in society, but it was not an intellectual force, and hardly a moral one in our sense of the word. It was an instinctive cult of natural forces, which were blind and amoral, save insofar as war itself creates a certain rudimentary, heroic ethos. Now, with the reception of Christianity, the old gods and their rites were rejected as manifestations of the power of evil. Religion was no longer an instinctive homage to the dark underworld of the id. It became a conscious and continual effort to conform human behavior to the requirements of an objective moral law and an act of faith in a new life and in sublimated patterns of spiritual perfection. The sense of guilt was transferred from the corporate responsibility of the blood feud to the sphere of the individual conscience. It became the sense of sin and produced as a correlative the act of repentance. Now, this spirit of moral effort and this consciousness of personal responsibility have remained characteristic of Western Christian culture. It may even be argued that they are its essential characteristics, and that all its external political and material achievements have been to the considerable extent conditioned by them. Of course, it may be said that all civilizations are superego structures, and that it is precisely this which distinguishes civilization from barbarism. But at the same time, there are important differences in the part which religion plays in this process. In some cases, as in Hinduism, the sharp breach with the forces of the id, which was characteristic of the conversion of the West, has never taken place, and the life is not conceived as a process of moral effort and discipline, but as an expression of cosmic libido, as in the dance of Siva. On the other hand, in Buddhism, we see a very highly developed superego, but here the superego is allied with the death impulse, so that the moralization of life is at the same time a regressive process that culminates in nirvana. No doubt similar tendencies were present in the Western world and find expression in the intermittent outbreaks of Manichaeanism and other forms of religious and metaphysical dualism. But the characteristic feature of Western civilization has always been a spirit of moral activism, by which the individual superego has become a dynamic social force. In other words, the Christian tradition has made the conscience of the individual person an independent power, which tends to weaken the omnipotence of social custom and to open the social process to new individual initiatives. At the present time, historians and sociologists are no doubt inclined to minimize the effect of moral and religious idealism or conscious moral effort on the course of social development, and to concentrate their attention on material motives, conflicts of material interest, and the influence of economic forces. But whatever our ultimate religious and philosophical views may be, it is unjustifiable to rule out one series of historical factors because we do not agree with the beliefs and ideals that are associated with them. Take the case of modern Western colonial expansion. The historian and the sociologist have the right to dismiss the explanations of 19th century imperialists with regard to the civilizing mission of the Anglo-Saxon race, and so forth, as an idealistic excuse to disguise the real facts of imperialistic exploitation. Equally, they have the right to regard the prospector or the trader as more genuine representatives of the colonial movement than the missionary or the educationalist. But they have not the right to deny the existence of the Western missionary movement as a factor in colonial expansion, nor even to identify the two elements and to regard the missionary as an agent of capitalism with his collar turned back to front. And the same principle must be applied to the history of Western Christendom in general. The historian may well argue that the feudal baron is more typical of medieval culture than the monk or the friar. He may equally point out how the church became a stronghold of feudal privilege, but he cannot deny that Christianity was one of the formative powers in medieval culture, or that throughout the whole course of Western history there was a spiritual elite which was sincerely devoted to putting their ideals into practice and making the Christian way of life a reality, while at the same time the whole society was generally united in the acceptance of Christian beliefs and in at least a theoretic acceptance of Christian moral standards. Now, when these conditions have obtained over a continuous period of more than 1,000 years, it is difficult to deny that they must have had a great cumulative effect on the life of Western man and the forms of Western thought and feeling. Indeed, it may be argued that Western culture as a whole is the fruit of this 1,000 years of continuous spiritual effort, and that there is no aspect of European life which has not been profoundly affected by it. If this is true, as I believe it to be, it seems to follow that the history that we ought to study, the history that really matters, is the history of this dynamic spiritual process, rather than that of the conflicts and rivalries of the various European states. But is such a study possible? The main obstacle is certainly not lack of material, it is rather the wealth of material which is still lying unused and sometimes unknown. It is not so long ago that Henri Bremond wrote his literary history of religious sentiment in France in the 17th century, which even in its 10 volumes is still but a fragment of the work which he had planned. But even so, he disclosed a whole new field of study of which even specialists were largely unaware. And this is only one example of the rich mines of unused material for European cultural history, which lie, as it were, at our very doors. No, the real difficulty that stands in the way of these studies is an ideological or spiritual one, which affects the very heart of the problem. If European culture is the external expression of a dynamic spiritual process, how do we ourselves stand towards it? Are we part of that process, or to some different process altogether? And is it possible to study the spiritual process of Western culture without taking sides one way or the other? Now, in the first place, the acceptance of the Christian faith is not an essential condition for the study of Christian culture. It is perfectly possible in theory to appreciate and to study Western culture as a spiritual whole without being a Christian. That was, after all, the position of many of the great liberal humanitarian historians and sociologists of the 19th century. But these men never regarded themselves as outside the European tradition, even in its spiritual aspect. They were very conscious of the moral dynamism of Christian culture, and they accepted its ethos wholeheartedly. In fact, they regarded themselves as having gone one better than their Christian predecessors by the attainment of a higher, purer, and more sublimated ethical ideal. In short, they regarded themselves as super Christians. Matthew Arnold is a typical example of this attitude, as we may see in Literature and Dogma, or the preface to his Irish essays. All this, however, has become a part of ancient history, an episode in an appendix to the process we have to study. The difficulty today is of a different nature. We have to face the emergence of a more fundamental criticism of Christian culture, which rejects its moral ideals and its psychological structure, no less than its metaphysical theory and its theological beliefs. It involves the reversal of the spiritual revolution which gave birth to Western culture and a return to the psychological situation of the old pagan world, whether it takes the form of a conscious neo pagan movement, as with the Nazis, or some form of materialism, which is equally opposed to the Christian worldview. It is a revolt against the moral process of Western culture and the dethronement of the individual conscience from its dominant position at the heart of the cultural process. Consequently, it means that the sense of guilt loses its personal character and is reabsorbed in the mass consciousness, reappearing not indeed in the old form of the blood feud, but in the parallel phenomena of racial hatred and class war, whereby the sense of guilt is extroverted and transferred to a guilty race or a guilty class, which thus becomes a psychological scapegoat. Now, wherever this revolution has taken place, there is no longer any room for the understanding of Christian culture. It simply becomes a question of explaining away, so that to the Nazi, the achievements of Christian culture are explained in detail as examples of the Nordic genius asserting itself in spite of the obstruction of Mediterranean Christian and Semitic influences, while for the Marxian, the history of Christendom must be rewritten in terms of the materialist interpretation of history, thus entirely altering the sense and direction of the movement of history. The results of the new historiography may be seen in Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, or in the short history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which is perhaps even more significant, owing to its official and anonymous character. This psychological breach with the old European Christian tradition is a much more serious thing than any political or economic revolution, for it means not only the dethronement of the moral conscience, but also the abdication of the rational consciousness, which is inseparably bound up with it. It is indeed doubtful if Western society can survive the change, for it is not a return to the past or to the roots of our social life. It is too radical for that. Instead of going downstairs step by step, neo paganism jumps out of the top story window, and whether one jumps out of the right hand window or the left makes very little difference by the time one reaches the pavement. The alternative to this suicidal technique is to accept the existence of Christian culture as an objective historical fact and try to understand it by its own ideas and to judge it by its own standards, as classical scholars have done in the past with regard to the culture of the ancient world. For it is both unscholarly and unphilosophical to look at Byzantine culture through the eyes of the 18th century rationalist, or medieval culture through the eyes of a 19th century Protestant, or Christian culture in general through the eyes of a materialist. Instead of these ways of looking at the past from outside as something alien, let us try to study Western Christian culture from the Christian point of view, to see it as a new way of life which was brought into Europe nearly 1900 years ago when St. Paul set sail from Troy to Macedonia, and gradually expanded until it became accepted as the universal standard of the European way of life. This does not mean that we ought to ignore or slur over the gap between Christian ideals and social realities. On the contrary, the existence of this dualism created that state of vital tension, which is the condition of European culture. In every age and every Western society, this tension expresses itself in different forms, from the simple, straightforward dualism of Christian culture and pagan barbarism, which we see in Bede's ecclesiastical history, to the intense inner conflict, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, which we see in a Pascal or a Kierkegaard. Where this tension is absent, where civilization has become autarkic, self sufficient, and self satisfied, there the process of Christian culture has been extinguished or terminated. But even today, we can hardly say that this has happened. Indeed, what we have seen during the last century has been something very different, an increase in spiritual tension which has become almost worldwide, although it has lost the positive element of religious faith that was an essential condition of its creative power in Europe in the past. It is obvious that there is a profound difference between the old dualism of the Christian way of life and unregenerate human nature on the one hand, and the new dualism between the revolutionary ideas of liberalism, nationalism, and socialism, and the traditional order of society on the other. But there is a certain relation between the two, so that it is possible to maintain that the whole revolutionary tradition is a post Christian phenomenon, which transposes a pre existent psychological pattern to a different sociological tradition. But even if that were the case, it would make it all the more important to understand how the archetypal pattern had originated. We know as yet too little about the modern revolutionary social situation to understand it as a whole, but this is not the case with the ages of Christian culture that preceded it. Here, the documentary evidence is more extensive than for any comparable period of world history. We know not only the course of its development from the beginning, we know the lives and thoughts of the men who played the leading part in that development from the beginning. We can study the development on every social and intellectual level, from the highest to the lowest, and in relation to all kinds of environments and social traditions. It is from this development that the unity of Western culture is derived. For Europe is not a political creation. It is a society of peoples who shared the same faith and the same moral values. The European nations are part of a wider spiritual society, and it is only by studying the nature of the whole that we can understand the functions of the parts. We have become so accustomed to studying the parts without reference to the whole that we are in danger of forgetting that there is any such thing as a cultural whole, a thing which the old classical humanist educators never entirely lost sight of, even when they seemed most pedantic. But this neglect of the study of our culture has been accidental rather than intentional. It resulted from a complication of different factors, some of which I have already discussed. The time has come to repair this mistake. If we deliberately perpetuate it, now that we know what is at stake, if we consciously permit the guidance of the modern world to pass from the leaders of culture to the servants of power, then we shall have a heavier responsibility than the politicians for the breakdown of Western civilization. No doubt there are very great practical difficulties in the way of a study which involves living religious issues as well as historical ones. Difficulties as between Christians and non Christians, and still more between the adherents of the different forms of Christianity. But these difficulties are essentially practical, since none of the parties concerned, not even the non Christian, is opposed in principle to the study of the Christian culture of the past as an objective historical phenomenon. Indeed, our own past is so deeply rooted in that culture that any refusal to study it means a refusal of history itself. Moreover, the field of work is so wide that there is ample room for all our schools of thought and all our social and religious traditions to follow their own lines of study without jostling one another. In history, as in other branches of knowledge, there must inevitably be controversy and difference of opinion on 1,000 particular points. But the justification of such conflicts is that they elucidate and do not obscure or obstruct. The essential task is to understand Christian culture as a whole, arising from the impact of Christianity on classical culture and Western barbarism, and creating from these dissimilar elements a new spiritual world, which forms the background of modern history. For if we try to ignore or explain away this creative process in order to enhance the importance of our own national achievement or that of some contemporary political ideology, we deprive ourselves of our own cultural inheritance and narrow the intelligibility of history. Such mistakes are possible. They have taken place in the past, and insofar as they have occurred, they mark the great setbacks in the history of civilization. It is one of the greatest tasks of education to prevent this from happening and to keep alive the common tradition of culture through the Dark Ages or the periods of sudden catastrophe, when mass opinion is under the influence of passion and fear, and when the individual has become the slave of economic necessity.